I'm Adam Chen, the wedding planner who makes impossible dreams come true. Flamingos in tutus, skydiving ceremonies, underwater weddings, the more outrageous, the better. But nothing prepared me for my biggest challenge. A greedy HOA that decided to rent out my newly purchased Malibu beach house without permission. When I arrived to move in, I found strangers barbecuing on my deck. They had a rental contract signed by HOA President Carla Hartman. The HOA was illegally renting out my property and pocketing the money. Most people would sue. I had a better plan. I created a fake identity, Maximilian Ashworth Chen, an eccentric millionaire with outrageous rental demands. Bronze lion statues, personal chefs, interpretive dance classes. I made the HOA spend a fortune trying to satisfy my impossible requests while filming everything for social media. By the time I revealed the truth, they were bankrupt, humiliated, and facing lawsuits. Sometimes the best revenge is giving people exactly what they ask for. I had just bought my dream house, a charming two-story beach cottage in Malibu with weathered shingles and a wraparound porch facing the Pacific. After years of planning impossible weddings, I finally had enough money for my own slice of paradise. The realtor had praised the quiet neighborhood and active community association. When I arrived with my moving truck on a bright Tuesday morning in March, I found a family of tourists from Ohio barbecuing on my deck. The father, a large man in a Hawaiian shirt, was assembling a portable grill while his wife directed their children in a beach volleyball game that used my flower beds as boundaries. They seemed as confused as I was when I explained this was my property. The husband, Bob, waved a rental agreement with the official Sunset Vista HOA letterhead, complete with signatures and seals. They'd paid $3,000 for a week-long stay in what the contract described as a premium oceanfront vacation rental with modern amenities and designer furnishings. Bob's wife showed me photos on her phone, professional shots of my house, staged to look like a luxury resort. The HOA president, Carla Hartman, had been running an elaborate rental scam, illegally renting out my property and pocketing the money while I was going through the purchase process. Most people would sue. I had a better plan. My experience in event planning had taught me that the most effective way to handle difficult clients wasn't confrontation. It was giving them exactly what they asked for, but with such elaborate flair that they'd never ask again. A bride who insisted on something absolutely unique learned to be more specific after I suggested trained peacocks as ring bearers and a reception menu consisting entirely of foods that were extinct colors. The principle worked beautifully in reverse, too. I remembered one particularly demanding mother of the bride who insisted her daughter's wedding needed to be the most talked-about event of the social season. She kept pushing for more elaborate elements until I presented her with a proposal for a ceremony featuring live polar bears, an ice sculpture the size of a small building, and a reception menu that required importing ingredients from 6 different continents. The final cost estimate was approaching the gross domestic product of a small nation. She suddenly decided that perhaps simplicity was more elegant after all. I spent the evening researching the most outrageous luxury rental requests I could find online. There were oil executives who demanded their temporary residences be completely redecorated to match their yacht, down to having the carpet replaced with materials that exactly matched their deck flooring. Tech billionaires who required private chefs, personal masseuses, and climate-controlled wine cellars for weekend getaways. One pharmaceutical heiress had reportedly insisted that her rental property's swimming pool be drained and refilled daily with water that had been blessed by monks from a specific monastery in Tibet. The stories were absurd, but they gave me a roadmap for what the truly wealthy considered essential amenities. More importantly, they showed me how the ultra-rich communicated their demands, with complete confidence that money could solve any problem and total disregard for the practical difficulties their requests might create for others. I found forums where luxury property managers shared their most challenging client stories. There was the cryptocurrency mogul who required all furniture to be arranged according to feng shui principles that changed daily based on market fluctuations. The pharmaceutical heiress who demanded that every flower in the landscaping be replaced with varieties that matched her birth chart. The oil executive's son who insisted on having a personal meditation guru available 24 hours a day, but only one who had studied with a specific teacher in the Himalayas. Reading these accounts was like studying a foreign language, the dialect of extreme wealth, and its accompanying eccentricities. I began to understand the rhythms of how these requests were made. The casual tone that suggested spending $50,000 to recreate a specific type of forest lighting was perfectly reasonable. The underlying assumption that any desire could be fulfilled with sufficient resources. The next morning, I began my transformation. Years of helping nervous grooms perfect their wedding day appearance had taught me a thing or two about dramatic presentation. I selected my most expensive suit, a charcoal gray Italian number I'd bought for a client's Gatsby-themed reception, and paired it with a burgundy silk tie that cost more than most people's monthly groceries. The suit had originally been part of a costume budget for a wedding that recreated scenes from classic Hollywood films, and it made me look like someone who belonged in a luxury magazine spread. The piece de resistance was a meticulously groomed beard that I'd been growing for a medieval wedding theme the previous month. With some careful trimming and quality beard oil that cost more per ounce than vintage champagne, it gave me the distinguished air of old money that I was aiming for. The beard had originally been part of a character I was developing for a Renaissance-themed wedding where the groom wanted to look like a Medici prince, and it added exactly the right touch of aristocratic gravitas to my appearance. A pair of aviator sunglasses with frames that cost more than most people's rent, and a vintage leather briefcase that I'd purchased from an estate sale completed the look. The briefcase had belonged to a banker from the 1950s and had the kind of worn elegance that suggested generations of family wealth rather than nouveau riche ostentation. I practiced my new persona in the mirror, channeling every wealthy, eccentric client I'd ever worked with. The slight accent was borrowed from a British lord who'd hired me to recreate his family's castle for his daughter's wedding, complete with importing craftsmen from Scotland to build authentic stone walls around the reception venue. The imperious tone came from a tech mogul's wife who demanded I source caviar from a specific region of Russia and had it flown in on a private jet to ensure maximum freshness for her anniversary party. The gestures were adapted from a pharmaceutical heiress who conducted every conversation as if she were addressing servants in a period drama. The result was a character who was both believable and completely insufferable, exactly the kind of wealthy eccentric who would make impossible demands while remaining convinced that their money entitled them to anything they desired. I spent hours perfecting the balance between cultured sophistication and casual arrogance that seemed to characterize the ultra-wealthy clients I'd encountered. My phone call to Carla that afternoon was a masterpiece of entitled arrogance. I introduced myself as Maximilian Ashworth Chen, a luxury lifestyle consultant who was extremely interested in the premium rental property they'd advertised. My voice carried just the right combination of boredom and expectation, as if calling about rental properties was something my assistant usually handled. But I had decided to involve myself personally due to my exacting standards. When she seemed confused about which property I meant, I described my own house in terms that made it sound like a palatial estate rather than a modest beach cottage. I spoke of the oceanfront property with the wraparound terraces and mature landscaping, emphasizing the prime location with unobstructed water views and the charming architectural details that suggested old California elegance. Carla's voice immediately shifted to the syrupy tone reserved for high-paying customers. She assured me that the Sunset Vista community specialized in accommodating discerning guests and that they would be delighted to discuss my requirements. Her enthusiasm was almost palpable as she described their commitment to luxury service and their experience with high-profile clientele who valued privacy and exceptional amenities. When I mentioned that my typical rental budget wasn't just fixed, that it started at $15,000 per month but could easily climb considerably higher for properties that truly understood and catered to my specific standards, I could almost hear the whirring of Carla's mental calculator clicking away through the phone line. Her tone shifted subtly, becoming even more accommodating if that were possible. She began to speak animatedly about premium service packages, options I hadn't even been aware their establishment offered, and a level of concierge-style support that sounded quite comprehensive. It was clear she was envisioning the rather substantial commission she stood to earn from such an elaborate and, for her, unprecedented rental arrangement. The potential numbers were clearly doing their work on her resolve. My initial list of requirements, the one I presented to her after the budget discussion, was purposefully designed to be, shall we say, extensive. I explained to Carla in a calm and measured tone that the entire property would need a complete redecoration. I termed the style I was seeking contemporary aristocratic. I made it clear this wasn't merely about swapping out a few old chairs for new ones or hanging a different set of curtains. No, this was about cultivating an entire environment, an atmosphere that would resonate with my deeply ingrained, refined sensibilities. It had to be a space that actively supported my lifestyle, which, as I explained, involved consulting with some of the world's most sophisticated and discerning individuals. The setting itself needed to speak of a certain lineage and understanding. This naturally meant that all the existing furniture would have to be replaced with pieces that met my exacting and quite particular standards. For instance, I communicated my need for leather sofas, specifically in a rich cognac brown. But this wasn't a simple matter of color and material. I specified that the leather had to be hand-selected Italian hides, full grain, of course. And not just any hides, but ones that had been meticulously aged for a minimum of 7 years. Furthermore, the treatment of these hides was paramount. They had to have been processed using traditional, almost forgotten methods, techniques that dated back to Renaissance craftsmen, ensuring a suppleness and durability that modern processes simply couldn't replicate. The crucial detail, I stressed, was the patina. It needed to possess that specific, subtle sheen, that depth of character suggesting generations of careful, appreciative use by distinguished families, as if these pieces had been cherished heirlooms. Persian rugs, I continued, were absolutely essential to grounding the aesthetic. But again, I had to guide her understanding. These could not be ordinary, mass-produced Persian rugs one might find in a department store. I required genuine antiques, pieces whose value would comfortably exceed that of most people's cars. Ideally, these rugs would come with documented provenance, tracing their history, preferably showing they had been owned by notable historical figures. I mentioned, almost as an aside, that I harbored a particular fondness for rugs that had once graced the drawing rooms of pioneering oil barons or the private carriages of visionary railroad magnates from a bygone era. Such items, I explained, carried the proper kind of foundational energy, a resonance suitable for someone of my particular background and outlook. The selection of artwork was equally specific and critical to the overall ambiance. I conveyed that I required original pieces, artworks that would subtly reflect my sophisticated tastes. The artists, I elaborated, should ideally be those who were recognized by major museums and institutions, lending a certain credibility, but they shouldn't be so ubiquitously famous that displaying their work would seem like a blatant, almost vulgar ostentation. I much preferred, I explained to Carla, subtle demonstrations of wealth and cultural capital over obvious loud ones. True aristocracy, I reminded her, never needed to announce itself too loudly. Its presence was felt, not shouted. The absolute centerpiece of my vision, the item around which much of the living space would be oriented, was a life-sized bronze lion statue. This, I explained, was non-negotiable. Lions, I shared, were my spiritual animal, a powerful totem for me, and I simply couldn't envision feeling truly at home, truly myself, without one of noble bearing nearby, watching over the domain. And not just any lion statue would do. It absolutely had to be cast by a specific Italian sculptor, an artist whose family, I informed her, had been masters of bronze work, even serving the Vatican for an unbroken line of 3 centuries. Only their time-honored traditional techniques, passed down through generations, could possibly capture the precise blend of fierce nobility and quiet strength that I required in my immediate living space. This significant statue, I continued, would need to be imported directly from the artist's studio in Florence. The shipping itself would require a climate-controlled container to meticulously preserve the delicate patina that was so integral to its character. Once it arrived, it would need to be installed by a team of specialists, individuals who understood the nuances of handling museum-quality bronze work, who could position it with the care and reverence such an artifact deserved. I assured Carla that I would naturally cover all the considerable shipping and installation costs associated with this piece. However, the HOA would need to take point on coordinating the complex logistics, ensuring that the installation team had the proper unimpeded access and all necessary equipment to perform their task flawlessly. When I told Carla about needing that huge bronze lion statue from Italy and how it had to be shipped and installed just so, her quick yes told me she was already figuring out her cut from such a big deal. She sounded super confident, saying they knew designers and art dealers who handled this fancy stuff all the time. She admitted the timing might be tricky, but they were all about pleasing their best clients, and I was clearly one of them now. Next, I got into my food needs, which were just as particular. I let her know I'd need a personal chef every weekend. But not just any cook. This person had to be trained in molecular gastronomy, someone who could turn classic food into art, making every meal an experience, not just something to eat. It was about really using all your senses. Breakfast, I explained, couldn't be a repeat. Each morning it should reflect what was happening with the seasons outside and even how I was feeling about nature. I mentioned I had some pretty deep ideas about food, like how ingredients should be picked based on the moon's phases and cooked in ways that respected their natural energy. For dinner parties with my important guests, I told her I'd need a full catering team. The servers had to be really discreet, able to move around without interrupting big conversations. I hinted that my usual friends were quite famous, though I didn't name names, of course. I made it clear all the staff would have to sign papers to keep everything private and pass background checks, because my guests expected that. The lighting situation, however, was perhaps my most elaborate and non-negotiable demand, fundamental to my well-being. I carefully explained to Carla that I suffered from a rather rare and delicate condition, one that made me extremely, almost painfully sensitive to ordinary artificial lighting. This condition, which I suggested had genetic roots and tended to run in certain old aristocratic bloodlines, meant that standard electrical illumination, the kind found in almost every home and establishment, caused me severe, debilitating headaches and profoundly disrupted my natural sleep patterns. Therefore, the entire house, every single room, would need to be completely retrofitted with a custom-designed LED system. This wouldn't be a simple dimmer switch setup. I required a system sophisticated enough to meticulously simulate different times of day and a wide array of weather conditions with utmost accuracy. More specifically, I expressed my need for the system to be able to recreate the precise, unique quality of light found in my family's ancestral estate nestled in the Scottish Highlands, a place where I had spent many formative childhood summers. That particular luminescence held deep personal significance. The system, I further detailed, needed to be fully programmable, capable of gradually and subtly shifting its output throughout the entire day, seamlessly mimicking the natural progression of sunlight as it moves through different seasons and changing weather patterns, from the soft light of dawn to the warm glow of sunset, and even the ethereal silver of moonlight, creating a completely harmonious and supportive luminous environment. This intricate system, I hinted, would also need to incorporate the previously discussed star-field projection capabilities for my evening relaxation and the specialized wavelength fixtures for my crystal collection, all integrated into one seamless, responsive whole. For evening entertainment, I required a star-field projection system that could recreate any night sky from anywhere in the world. This wasn't just about aesthetics. I explained that my work as a lifestyle consultant often involved clients from different parts of the globe, and being able to show them familiar constellations helped establish the personal connections that were essential to my business relationships. The lighting system also needed to include specialized fixtures for my collection of rare crystals, which required specific wavelengths of light to display their full beauty. I mentioned that crystal energy was an important part of my daily wellness routine, and that improperly illuminated stones could actually have negative effects on the spiritual atmosphere of a space. The initial installation cost would run somewhere in the neighborhood of $30,000, but money was no object when it came to my comfort and the proper presentation of my lifestyle. I suggested that such an advanced lighting system would actually increase the property's value and appeal to other sophisticated renters in the future. Carla's responses grew more strained with each conversation, but her greed kept her saying yes. She assured me that the HOA had connections with high-end contractors and lighting designers who specialized in luxury smart home installations. The project would require permits and electrical work, but they had experience navigating the local regulatory environment for high-end property modifications. I could sense her growing panic beneath the professional veneer. Each phone call brought new complications as she tried to coordinate my impossible requests. The lion statue required special permits and structural reinforcement to ensure the floor could support its weight. The chef situation was complicated by my insistence that they also be certified in wine pairing and floral arrangement, skills that I considered essential for anyone responsible for creating complete sensory experiences. The lighting project had evolved into a full smart home automation system that would cost more than most people's annual salaries. But Carla pressed on, driven by visions of the enormous rental fees and her cut of the profits. She even started suggesting additional amenities that I might enjoy, a private yoga instructor perhaps, or a car detailing service for my luxury vehicles. I graciously accepted each suggestion, adding my own elaborate specifications that sent her scrambling back to her contractors. The yoga instructor would need to be trained in ancient Tibetan techniques and fluent in Sanskrit. The car detailing service would need to use only organic products that wouldn't interfere with the spiritual energy of my vintage European automobiles. After 2 weeks of watching Carla juggle my increasingly ridiculous demands, I decided to escalate the situation. I called to inform her that I'd changed my mind about exclusive occupancy. Instead, I wanted to curate a community of like-minded individuals who would share the space with me. Think of it as a luxury commune for the culturally sophisticated. The concept, I explained, was based on historical salons where intellectuals and artists gathered to exchange ideas and inspire each other's creative work. I had been inspired by the great cultural gatherings of the past, the artistic communities of 1920s Paris, the intellectual circles of Renaissance Florence, the creative colonies of early California. I wanted to recreate that atmosphere of refined bohemianism for the modern era. This meant I would need to personally interview and approve any other tenants who might be staying at the property. But these wouldn't be ordinary interviews. I required what I called compatibility assessments that would test each candidate's artistic sensibilities and cultural awareness. Anyone staying in my curated environment would need to contribute to the overall aesthetic and intellectual atmosphere. I explained to Carla that I couldn't simply allow random tourists to disrupt the carefully crafted energy I was creating. Each potential resident would need to demonstrate their commitment to higher pursuits and their ability to engage meaningfully with beauty, culture, and sophisticated discourse. The screening process would be thorough but essential for maintaining the standards that my lifestyle required. My first audition was with a perfectly ordinary couple from Phoenix who had booked the house for their anniversary weekend. Jerry and Susan Miller seemed pleasant enough. He worked in insurance, she taught elementary school. But they had no idea what they were walking into when I arrived for their compatibility assessment. I appeared at the front door wearing my full Maximilian costume, complete with a silk ascot that I'd borrowed from a Victorian wedding prop collection, and a walking stick topped with an ornate silver handle that had belonged to my grandfather. The walking stick added exactly the right touch of aristocratic authority, and I used it to gesture dramatically while speaking. I explained to the bewildered couple that they would need to demonstrate their commitment to the artistic lifestyle before I could approve their residency. The contemporary world had lost touch with beauty, I told them, and those of us with refined sensibilities had a responsibility to preserve and celebrate cultural excellence wherever we found ourselves. The compatibility assessment involved asking them to interpret various abstract concepts through movement and expression. I started with simple concepts to ease them into the process. Could they embody the essence of a stormy Tuesday? How would they physically represent the concept of financial anxiety? What would hope look like if it were a dance? Jerry gamely attempted what looked like modern dance mixed with yoga poses, while Susan stood frozen in confusion. I explained that creative expression required vulnerability and a willingness to move beyond conventional boundaries. True artistic appreciation meant being comfortable with ambiguity and willing to explore new ways of understanding the world. I took detailed notes on a gold-plated clipboard that I'd purchased specifically for this performance, nodding seriously at their efforts while murmuring comments about their kinetic vocabulary and emotional authenticity. I asked follow-up questions about their interpretive choices and suggested ways they could deepen their physical expressions of abstract ideas. After 20 minutes of this performance art evaluation, I declared them promising but in need of further development. They could stay, but only if they agreed to participate in daily mindfulness circles where we would explore the intersection of consciousness and creative expression. They would also need to contribute to our communal art projects, which would involve collaborative installations using found objects and natural materials. I handed them a detailed schedule of activities that included morning meditation sessions, afternoon discussions of philosophical texts, and evening presentations where each resident would share their insights about beauty and meaning in contemporary life. The schedule looked like a college syllabus crossed with a wellness retreat brochure. Jerry asked if they could just pay for a normal vacation rental instead. I explained sadly that once the artistic process had begun, it was impossible to simply retreat into conventional thinking. They had already been exposed to higher possibilities, and it would be a disservice to their spiritual development to allow them to settle for ordinary tourist experiences. The couple from Phoenix checked out that same day. Carla's phone calls grew increasingly frantic. She couldn't understand why I was driving away paying guests with my elaborate screening process. Her voice took on a pleading quality as she tried to explain that the HOA's rental business depended on satisfied customers who would recommend the properties to their friends and return for future visits. I explained patiently that maintaining the right energy in a luxury environment required careful curation of all residents. Quality was far more important than quantity when it came to creating the perfect living experience. Anyone could rent space to tourists, but I was offering something much more valuable, transformation through exposure to elevated consciousness and refined aesthetic principles. My second audition was even more elaborate. I'd prepared a written examination that tested the candidates' knowledge of obscure art movements, their ability to pair wines with specific emotional states, and their opinions on the philosophical implications of interior design choices. The questions were completely nonsensical, but I delivered them with such academic seriousness that most people tried earnestly to answer. The exam included questions like, how does the color burgundy relate to the concept of temporal displacement? And, if Dadaism were a type of weather, what would be the appropriate attire? And, describe the emotional resonance of a room furnished, entirely in objects that begin with the letter M. One particularly memorable candidate was a businessman named Rick, who had rented the house for a work retreat. He was a software executive from Seattle who'd planned to spend the weekend reviewing quarterly reports and preparing presentations for his company's board meeting. Instead, he found himself spending 45 minutes trying to explain how Dadaism related to modern corporate strategy, while I nodded and made cryptic notes. Rick's answers were actually quite creative. He suggested that Dadaism's rejection of logical patterns could inform innovative approaches to market disruption. He proposed that the movement's embrace of chance and spontaneity might inspire more creative problem-solving in business contexts. I was almost disappointed by how thoughtfully he engaged with my ridiculous questions. When I asked him to demonstrate his understanding through interpretive sculpture using only items from his briefcase, he actually attempted to build something artistic from his laptop, business cards, and a promotional stress ball. The resulting construction looked like a modernist commentary on the relationship between technology and human anxiety. I approved him conditionally, but only after he agreed to host weekly salons where residents could discuss the intersection of commerce and creativity. The salons would explore questions like whether profit motives were compatible with artistic integrity and how business leaders could incorporate aesthetic principles into their decision-making processes. I provided him with a detailed reading list that included everything from ancient philosophy to contemporary art criticism. He would need to prepare discussion questions for each text and facilitate conversations that helped other residents explore these complex ideas. I also suggested that he might want to consider how his own work could become a form of artistic expression rather than mere economic activity. Rick left within hours of receiving my detailed guidelines for salon topics and required reading lists. His final email mentioned something about finding a more traditional vacation rental experience, which I interpreted as a retreat from the challenging growth opportunities I had offered him. Quality was far more important than quantity when it came to creating the perfect living experience. My second audition was even more elaborate. I'd prepared a written examination that tested the candidates' knowledge of obscure art movements, their ability to pair wines with specific emotional states, and their opinions on the philosophical implications of interior design choices. The questions were completely nonsensical, but I delivered them with such academic seriousness that most people tried earnestly to answer. One particularly memorable candidate was a businessman who had rented the house for a work retreat. He spent 45 minutes trying to explain how Dadaism related to modern corporate strategy, while I nodded and made cryptic notes. When I asked him to demonstrate his understanding through interpretive sculpture using only items from his briefcase, he actually attempted to build something artistic from his laptop, business cards, and a promotional stress ball. I approved him conditionally, but only after he agreed to host weekly salons where residents could discuss the intersection of commerce and creativity. He left within hours of receiving my detailed guidelines for salon topics and required reading lists. Word of my unconventional tenant selection process began spreading through the HOA community like wildfire. Carla found herself fielding complaints from confused renters who couldn't understand why their beach vacation had turned into an avant-garde art experience, and angry neighbors who were witnessing increasingly bizarre activities in what they thought was a quiet residential neighborhood. The bronze lion statue had arrived on a Tuesday morning in a spectacle that involved a small crane, 3 professional art handlers, and a traffic jam that lasted most of the afternoon. The delivery truck was longer than most of the driveways in the neighborhood, and the crane required closing off half the street while they maneuvered the statue through my front door. Neighbors gathered to watch the installation process, taking photos and videos that would later circulate on social media with captions like, "Meanwhile in Malibu," and "When you have too much money." The statue itself was magnificent, a bronze lion in a regal pose, weighing nearly 400 pounds and standing almost 6 feet tall. The artist had captured every detail of the mane, the powerful muscles, even the individual whiskers. It looked like something that belonged in a museum or the estate of a European nobleman. Positioned in my living room, it dominated the space and created an atmosphere that was both impressive and completely ridiculous. My demands continued to evolve in increasingly artistic directions. I decided the house needed a meditation labyrinth in the backyard, constructed from imported river stones and rare desert plants that would create a sacred space for contemplation and spiritual renewal. The labyrinth had to follow ancient Celtic patterns that I claimed had been passed down through my family for generations. The project would require a landscape architect who specialized in sacred geometry, a feng shui consultant to ensure proper energy flow, and possibly a permit from the Coastal Commission since the property was so close to protected wetlands. I explained to Carla that the labyrinth was essential for my daily spiritual practices and would also serve as a focal point for the group meditation sessions I planned to host for my fellow residents. The plants had to be sourced from specific regions and installed according to principles that honored their natural growing patterns and spiritual significance. I mentioned that I'd studied with shamanic healers who had taught me about the consciousness of plants and the importance of creating harmonious relationships between human intentions and natural energy systems. Carla's voice grew higher and more strained with each conversation as she tried to coordinate these elaborate modifications. The landscape architect she contacted was confused by my requirements and kept asking for clarification about the spiritual specifications for plant placement. The feng shui consultant charged consultation fees that were higher than most people's monthly rent and insisted on visiting the property multiple times to assess the energy patterns. The weekend chef situation had become a full-scale culinary theater production. I insisted that meals be served with accompanying performances that explained the inspiration behind each dish. This meant hiring not just a chef, but also a small troupe of interpretive dancers who could convey the emotional journey of ingredient preparation through movement. The chef, a talented woman named Isabella who had worked in Michelin-starred restaurants, seemed initially excited by the creative challenge. But her enthusiasm dimmed when I explained that each course needed to be accompanied by a performance that illustrated the spiritual relationship between the diner and the food. Breakfast became a 15-minute interpretive dance about the awakening of consciousness, accompanied by quinoa porridge that had been prepared according to ancient Andean techniques. The neighbors were not pleased with the dinner-hour interpretive dance sessions happening on what they thought was a quiet residential patio. Mrs. Henderson from next door called Carla to complain about the weird dancing people who were disturbing her evening television viewing. Mr. Rodriguez across the street was confused by the music and couldn't understand why people were expressing their feelings about vegetables through modern dance. I also began hosting what I called cultural salons for potential future tenants. These were elaborate screening events where candidates had to demonstrate their artistic worthiness through various creative challenges. The events were designed to look sophisticated and exclusive while being completely impossible to take seriously. One evening featured a wine tasting where participants had to compose haikus inspired by each vintage. I provided guidelines for connecting the sensory experience of wine with poetic expression, encouraging guests to explore how taste, aroma, and texture could be translated into words that captured deeper truths about existence and beauty. The wine selection included bottles that I'd chosen specifically for their pretentious descriptions and inflated prices. I served a Burgundy that the sommelier had described as expressing the terroir's conversation with centuries of monastic tradition, and a California Cabernet that supposedly captured the essence of fog-kissed mornings and entrepreneurial dreams. Participants struggled to create meaningful poetry while trying to identify notes of barnyard earthiness and hints of leather with undertones of tobacco and dark chocolate. One woman wrote a haiku about wine that tasted like purple thoughts in summer rain, which I praised as demonstrating exceptional sensitivity to the synesthetic possibilities of flavor experience. Another evening involved a cooking competition where the secret ingredient was childhood nostalgia, and contestants had to explain how their dishes captured specific memories while also reflecting their personal growth and artistic evolution. The challenge was absurd, but participants took it seriously, creating elaborate backstories for dishes that connected their food choices to formative experiences and philosophical insights. One contestant prepared scrambled eggs that represented his relationship with his grandmother, explaining how the texture reminded him of comfort and security, while the addition of herbs symbolized his adult appreciation for complexity and nuance. Another created a fruit salad that told the story of her family's immigration experience, with each ingredient representing a different stage of adaptation and cultural integration. I judged these competitions with the seriousness of a cooking show, providing detailed feedback about how successfully each dish communicated its intended emotional narrative. I praised creativity while offering suggestions for deeper exploration of the connections between food, memory, and artistic expression. The HOA board was starting to panic. Carla's carefully controlled rental empire was descending into chaos, and the neighbors were organizing complaints about the constant stream of confused visitors and bizarre activities. Property values were becoming a concern as word spread about the eccentric art collective that had apparently taken over a house in their quiet neighborhood. The situation escalated when Mrs. Patterson from down the street called the city to complain about unpermitted commercial activities. She'd observed what appeared to be regular business meetings disguised as artistic gatherings, with people coming and going at all hours and engaging in activities that seemed more like performance art than vacation relaxation. My social media documentation of these events was the final straw. I created an Instagram account for Maximilian Ashworth Chen that showcased the innovative luxury living experience at my Malibu retreat. Photos of the bronze lion statue positioned dramatically against ocean sunset backgrounds, videos of interpretive dinner performances with artistic lighting and sophisticated camera angles, and carefully curated shots of confused renters attempting mindfulness exercises began attracting attention from people who thought it was either brilliant performance art or a very expensive mental breakdown. The posts were designed to look like the lifestyle content that wealthy influencers typically shared, but with enough surreal elements to make viewers question whether they were real or elaborate satire. I included captions that mixed genuine wellness language with completely nonsensical spiritual concepts, creating content that was simultaneously believable and absurd. The posts went viral in the way that only truly bizarre content can. Local news stations picked up the story of the mysterious luxury lifestyle consultant who was transforming suburban Malibu into an avant-garde artist colony. The coverage was universally baffled but strangely fascinated, with reporters struggling to determine whether Maximilian was a visionary or simply very wealthy and very eccentric. Entertainment blogs began speculating about which celebrities might be involved in the project, since the production values were too high for an ordinary social media stunt. Art critics wrote think pieces about the intersection of performance art and luxury real estate. Business publications analyzed the potential market for experiential luxury rentals that offered cultural immersion rather than just high-end amenities. Carla's professional facade crumbled as neighbors complained about the constant chaos. Mrs. Henderson documented everything, calling it the circus next door, while Mr. Rodriguez started a petition with 15 signatures demanding HOA action. The rental income plummeted as normal tourists fled from my artistic requirements, leaving negative reviews about the weird art house rental. The breaking point came when I announced my Midsummer Cultural Festival, a week-long event requiring the pool converted to a reflecting pond, the garage transformed into a theater, and the yard redesigned as an outdoor art gallery. The cost approached 6 figures, which I expected the HOA to cover. When Carla suggested this was beyond normal rental amenities, I threatened to take my business elsewhere and warned that negative reviews from someone of my influence could destroy their reputation. The HOA called an emergency meeting about the Maximilian situation, questioning Carla's leadership as costs mounted and income declined. Meanwhile, my social media documentation went viral. Lifestyle bloggers and documentary filmmakers took notice, painting the HOA as either artistic visionaries or completely incompetent administrators who'd lost control of their neighborhood. The end came during my Sunset Vista Creativity Summit. When Carla found 30 people creating art while being live-streamed, she realized the truth. I was a professional event planner, not an eccentric client. I dropped the act. Adam Chen, the actual homeowner and wedding planner who had just spent 2 months proving why the HOA shouldn't rent out other people's property. The media attention brought city officials investigating the HOA's practices. Carla resigned in disgrace as the board faced fines and lawsuits. Within a month, the HOA acknowledged my ownership. I kept everything they'd paid for, the lion, lighting, and kitchen equipment. The neighbors forgave the chaos, and the new HOA president is reasonable.